We have got a fun video today, I think.
It's not that fun.
I think it's going to be a little fun.
We're talking about our shortcomings.
So today's video, we are going to talk about some of our biggest backpacking trip nightmares, and more importantly, the point of this is not just to rip on us, but to kind of tell you how we've learned from them.
Yeah, maybe prevent some mistakes for you all in the future.
Absolutely. Because we've been backpacking now for a long time, and we've screwed up a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that's true with any hobby, though.
Absolutely.
You got to make mistakes to learn.
So, we're talking our biggest backpacking nightmares and how we can teach you guys so they don't happen to you.
Yeah.
So the first, one of the most recent backpacking nightmares we had, we didn't talk about this at the time, but if you go back and watch our first backpacking trip with our wives video, we went to an area of Ohio called Lake Vesuvius, Lake Vesuvius is an area, effectively a backpacking area that surrounds a massive lake. Because of that, and because of the fact that it was in July, there's a lot of insects there.
Yeah, it's tremendously overgrown. And muggy.
And this was before we were into permethrin.
Yeah.
And we made the tragic mistake of not permethering.
Not soaking our gear.
Not soaking our hammocks in permethrin. And what happened on that trip is because it was so warm, we had all of our underquilts like fully vented, and all of our hammocks, including our wives, were single layer hammocks, and we got eaten alive
in the hammocks.
And like, I'm not even kidding you, Andy and I each probably had 30 welts.
Yeah, and it took weeks for them to go.
Weeks.
Yeah.
Like literally our whole sides and back, and Andy's wife too. And now my wife, she was lucky. She spent the night in a sleeping bag in her hammock.
Yeah, so she got an extra protection.
So then this is how we validated the fact that we got eaten alive while we were sleeping, is my wife was totally fine because she was in a sleeping bag in a hammock, so she had an extra layer, but we got eaten alive. It was legitimately terrible.
Yeah, it was terrible. And the weird thing is like, we didn't start noticing it until after we got home from the trip. Because the next morning we woke up and we're like, nothing was wrong. Yeah. But then the next day we're all texting in a group chat like, holy crap, what the heck happened to us?
Like welts. So like the mosquito got on us and sucked until it was done sucking. And like,
unless it wasn't a mosquito.
Unless it was a mosquito. Maybe it wasn't, but we each had probably 20 to 30 welts all over our like sides and undersides. It was awful. And after that happened, like, I will never not permethrin our hammocks and clothes. Everything permethrin everything now.
Yep. Yeah. I don't want to deal with that again.
It was awful, and it's to the point now where when we go back into these situations, and even if we are permethering, I will sometimes bring a sheet to sleep on top of, or I'll sleep on top of my quilt, because it was just awful. So the lesson there was permethrin your hammocks, at least spray the underside of it. If you're in a single layer hammock and it's vented and you're in an area with insects, you will get like roasted on all night. I mean, they'll just have a buffet on you. Potentially. So that was a massive mistake. That's never happening again.
Yeah, and it hasn't happened since then, so.
It hasn't happened since then, and we've been in situations, but we permethrin our hammocks now. Next kind of, we'll call it a backpacking nightmare. It wasn't so bad at the time, but definitely like a shortcoming of our trip planning and kind of just our thought process. So we recently got back from a 7-day trip through the Rocky Mountains in Colorado.
Yeah.
And we did a good job of trying to look at the forecast ahead of time, and like we looked at the temperatures in Denver, in the mountains, in Breckenridge, and it was like, okay, the lowest temperature we saw on the forecast was like 50. It was like 51, 52, because it was in end of August. We're like, oh, that's fine. We'll bring our 20-degree setups, and we'll throw a puffy jacket in there.
Just be nice.
Why not? Bryce didn't even bring pants because the forecast just wasn't that bad. When we got into the mountains, especially at elevation, we were dealing with temps like hovering around freezing. So literally 20 degrees colder than we planned for it. Now, luckily, we had been like, we'll just toss the puffy jackets in there. We probably won't wear it, but whatever. And luckily, I had brought in a pair of pants. But it was, the lack of foresight was we didn't really realize that when you're in the mountains and when you're at elevation, you got to subtract like 15 degrees off of what the lows are going to be.
Yeah, and I also think the important lesson here is that, I don't want to take away from the fact that we couldn't handle it, because our gear that we brought was set up for that kind of weather. It just was a little uncomfortable.
It was miserable at points.
Yeah, it was uncomfortable at points, but there was no real threat of hypothermia, honestly. But it would have been nice to have been more comfortable, around camp, that type of thing. But yeah, we definitely underestimated the weather there, and it would have been nice to have a few gloves
for sure,
maybe another base layer top or something like that to stay a little bit warmer, just to be more comfortable. And, if you watch that video, there's a couple of scenes where we're walking around in our quilts and stuff.
It's pretty hilarious, actually.
So we did fine. It worked out okay, but definitely it would have been nice to have been a little bit smarter and more prepared for that weather shift, to be a little bit more comfortable on the trip. So, lesson learned. So I think the only story that I can think of where there was a potential for actual physical bodily harm, and you weren't there, but I was backpacking with a good friend of mine in Michigan, near the Upper Peninsula. And, this was many, many years ago. Definitely.
You were in a tent, weren't you?
I was in a tent. My buddy was in a tent as well, many, many years ago. And we did have a Widowmaker fall in between the two of us. And our tents were between our two tents were probably 20 feet. So within that 20 feet, a Widowmaker fell between us. And it wasn't like a sapling. It was a legit...
it would have killed you?
I don't know. It's hard to say. It was I think it was a big spruce or hemlock or something like that. But it would have done some pretty serious bodily harm. And there was a big storm that rolled in that night. It was very windy. This was a situation where it could have been avoided because it was a legitimate Widowmaker. It was standing dead.
And it was windy too.
And it was very windy. Yeah, it was a fall in Michigan. So. Yeah, after that, it's don't be lazy about checking for Widowmakers and checking out your camp, because, people do die from that, and people, a lot of people get seriously injured, and that actually happened.
Yeah, it does.
And that could have caused serious damage. And what was scary is you heard it start coming down, and
it's nightmarish.
And we're zipped into tents and sleeping bags and stuff, and my buddy who I was with, he actually stood up in his tent and yanked the tent.
Oh, he did? Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yanked the tent out of the stakes, did this giant adrenaline dump, and just yanked the tent out of the tent, and then just rolled over. Even though it did miss him, even if his tent would have been, but he heard it coming, and he immediately yanked it up, pulled the tent out of the stakes, and just rolled as far as he could.
I don't know what you do in a hammock.
I don't know.
Unzip and
yeah. I honestly went into the fetal position.
Just pray.
Yeah. And it came down, and after it came down, we got out, of course, and inspected the damage, and it was no joke. So it was scary.
And we have a whole video on Widowmakers if you want to learn more about that and our thoughts on it. So check that out. So that's definitely a lessons learned. Check your trees if it's going to be windy. Check them twice, but check out our Widowmaker video for more stuff like that. So the last kind of backpacking nightmarish situation we'll talk about is it has to do with when you backpack with other people.
Yeah, I think before we get into the nitty-gritty details, the general concept here is be self-sufficient to yourself. Don't rely on others. For example, if you're backpacking with a group of people that you may not necessarily know very well, and somebody's like, oh, I'll bring the water filter, and I'll bring the cooking supplies, and I'll bring the fuel, to try to save weight, don't play that game, especially if you don't know them very well.
If you don't know them.
Be self-sufficient. Now, Kevin and I, sometimes we always carry our own filters, but sometimes like I'll bring a stove or he'll bring a stove. I am very confident that Kevin or myself will always bring that stove, and if the stove doesn't come there, then we're cold soaking, and that's okay. But I've definitely been burned in the past with this and having to rely on other people for gear that
don't do that,
that they maybe forgot or maybe didn't want to use the gear the same way that you were expecting to happen. So
we've all had those situations where you're backpacking with that guy, and just know, or that girl, I guess, just know that those people exist. Be self-sufficient. Unless you really know the other people you're with, just don't have to rely on them for anything.
Yeah, don't put yourself in a position where you're relying on others for anything. Gear, maps, locations, routes, planning.
Yeah. We've had some nightmarish situations where maybe we've let other people do the planning, or other people have said they're bringing certain pieces of gear, and either they brought it and it was broken, or they forgot to bring it and it kind of screws stuff. And that can really impact our trips. And it's needless. Like, that doesn't have to ever happen.
Yeah, and like to poke fun at our buddy Sam, who's
we're not referring to Sam when we talk about this.
Yeah, but like I would never be like, hey Sam, like you're in charge of the cooking gear. Like we would not eat.
We would just be no cook.
We would just be no cook because Sam would forget it. So yeah, just there's a lot of little nitpicky things that have happened in the past, and some serious things that have happened in the past where we've relied on other people for certain things, and we just get burned a lot. So obviously your good backpacking buddies that you do on a regular basis, maybe you feel a little bit more comfortable with that type of risk, but in general, if you watch Kevin and I's videos all the time and our trip videos, a lot of times we both bring stoves, and maybe we'll just use one of them, but I don't necessarily rely on Kevin, and he doesn't rely on me for gear.
And it's also like if something breaks, it's just nice to have two. So also kind of piggybacking on this in terms of like backpacking with other people. So first, like we said, make sure you're self-sufficient, but make sure like the people you're with can hack it. I don't know. There's no PC way to say that.
No, I think the PC way of saying is that if you're backpacking with a group of people that you don't necessarily know or have much experience with, make sure you have set up the trip accordingly to accommodate that person. So, when we backpack with Frozen, he slimmed down his miles for us. Because we're not at the level where we're comfortable, doing, 17 to 20 miles consistently every day. So he accommodated us with that. And so at the same point, like, know who you're with, and if the trip is set up properly for that person and honestly their level of fitness, to be honest.
And Andy and I have been on trips where we have been with people that just got in over their head, and maybe some of that's our fault for not recognizing that could happen, and it has negatively impacted our enjoyment.
It not only has it impacted our enjoyment of the trip, but it's also set up that person for failure.
For failure, yeah.
And that's not cool. Everybody's out there to have a good time, so just really, I think the overall concept is just be really cognizant about the people you're backpacking with.
Yeah, and understand pros, cons, and just be self-sufficient and take care of yourself. And if you're going to bring other people with you, make sure they're self-sufficient and make sure they're up to the challenge. A lot of people, especially people who haven't backpacked that much, are kind of drawn to like the romanticized notion of being out in the woods, being self-sufficient, but like backpacking is hard. It's not easy.
It's uncomfortable in some situations, and so some people get some real reminders when they get out there.
So just know who you're with, and just you can avoid some nightmarish situations if you deal with that up front. So that's it for this video. We just want to talk about situations that have gone poorly for us in the past.
Yeah, and so that you all can learn from it, and I'm sure everybody else has got their own mistakes that have happened, and post them in the comments.
Please, if you let us know.
If you want to out your embarrassing stories or the things that you've learned from you know, maybe we can learn from them as well, or agree. I'm sure we've made a bunch of other stupid mistakes as well that, you know, we could talk for hours about this, but it's always good to put this stuff out there and talk about what you've learned from these things.
So that's it for this video. Like Andy said, if you want to air your dirty laundry in the comments, go for it. But thank you all for watching, and we will see everybody on the next one.